So we're all aware that the frequency and impact of cybercrime is high in healthcare organization. There's no signs that it's slowing down anytime soon. So in this session, we're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about some actionable recommendations to reduce your risk of being a victim of cybercrime, or if you are a victim, to reduce the impact that your organization experiences from it. And we'll put an emphasis on quick wins. I also am going to spend a few minutes talking about the NIST cybersecurity framework, which gives us kind of the big overarching picture of how we can implement a strong cybersecurity program, but then we'll zero in on some specific tactical things we can do. So I wanted to start with a couple of questions, just for you to think about, not that we need to discuss, but just to kind of put yourself in that frame of mind if you're not already there. You know, if you knew that in the next 6 months you were going to be attacked in a very concerted way by, you know, a very skilled attacker, cyber attacker, and who had done their research, a targeted attack, what would you do for the next 6 months to get yourself ready for that? And of course, the subtext here is you probably are going to be attacked in the next 6 months in such a manner. And so are you doing the right things, or have you done the right things to be prepared for that? I said at the beginning that this would be a threat-based set of recommendations, or at least I'm saying it now if I forgot to say it. But what I mean by that is I looked at some recent threat reports, and I list some of the sources of information I looked at here. These are all good things for you to look at. The Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report, they actually just came out with a new one. The Mandiant Threat Report, the NTT Group Threat Report, which is here in the US, they go by Solutionary, as well as the Office of Civil Rights Resolution Agreements. There's been 23 resolution agreements from the Office of Civil Rights. We looked at those, as well as the critical security controls from the Council on Cybersecurity, and a couple of reports from PwC. And what I came to when I thought about if I was only going to do 5 things to reduce the risk of being a victim of cybercrime, what would I do? I came up with these 5. So we're going to spend some time talking about each of these, although we're going to take a quick detour and talk about the NIST cybersecurity framework. So the NIST cybersecurity framework was published about a year and a half ago now, February 2014. It came out as a result of a presidential order to develop a way to improve the cyber preparedness of critical infrastructure organizations such as healthcare. And I think it's important that we heed what this has to say and think about what we should do to incorporate these recommendations into our security program. So they've developed a core framework, and you see part of it up on the screen here. And they start with these 5 security functions that we all need to have robust capabilities in these areas to identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover related to cyber attacks. So it's a framework that's kind of ordered around our topic today of how to protect yourself from cybercrime and cyber attacks. So we'll spend a few minutes just looking at this framework a little more closely. What you just saw is what's called the framework core. So it's a set of security controls that are recommended. Beyond those 5 controls that we just discussed, it breaks it down into a number of categories. I think there are about 20 categories that you saw on the previous screen, and then subcategories, and there are about 100 subcategories. So you can think of those as your very specific controls that you're implementing. So in the example you see on the screen here, we've got the first function is identify. The first category under that function is asset management. The first 3 subcategories under there are listed. We'll just look at the first one, that physical devices and systems within the organization are inventoried. And then you see these informational references. So if you want to know how to accomplish that subcategory, you go to these informational references. So, for example, critical security control number 1 talks about this specific topic, as well as they list the NIST 853 controls and a number of other ISO security controls. So I think it's a very good way to look at things, a very valuable reference from that respect. Very timely, very up to date, very current. If you think about the HIPAA security rule, it was written 15 or 20 years ago. It's a little out of date. It's a little incomplete. This cybersecurity framework is much more current, much more best practice with what's occurring today. Now, in addition to this core, there are framework tiers. You can really just think of these as a way to score yourself with respect to how mature you are against each of these 100 controls. So everywhere, starting at a partial, you just have a partial implementation of that control, to a very adaptive, very robust implementation. So it's a pretty simple scoring. You're just going to score yourself 1 to 4. The way you can use this framework, you can use it in a lot of different ways, and this scoring. But one way you could do it is during a risk assessment, you could score your current state against these 100 subcategories or controls, and then talk about what's my target state, where should I be on each of these. So you may score a 1 on something. You say, I really want to be a 2, or I really want to be a 3. There's no one that's going to tell you you have to be a 4 on everything. That may not make sense. It may be too expensive of a investment for the organization, but it's all about risk management and weighing what you should do to be better prepared. And then finally, that is what these framework profiles are about, is scoring yourself and evaluating where you fall today and where you want to be with respect to these 100 controls. So let me just list a few benefits of using this cybersecurity framework. It is a great way to improve your cybersecurity program. I already mentioned this point that I think it's very up to date in terms of what are the best practices, especially with those informative references that are listed, the critical security controls and so on. Those are very up to date and best thinking on how to have a great security program. But what you might not think about is, and your executives will think about, is how do I demonstrate to regulators and to people that might sue me if I have a breach that I've really taken due care, that I've really done the right things in spite of the fact that we're not perfect and maybe we've had a breach. How do I make the case in the lawsuit, in a court, to say, no, we followed best practices. We were not negligent. We really were taking security seriously. And that's where this framework can help you to answer that question and to be able to demonstrate that this was presidential order, this was best practice, and we've really engaged a robust effort to implement this security framework. You'll also find, I think, that implementing this framework will improve collaboration within your organization. It'll kind of force you into the right kind of discussions at all levels of the organization, from the executive level to the security practitioners and the rest of the organization, about what's important and what we need to do. Okay, let's get to the more actionable. I think what I just said is very actionable, but it's something you're going to do over a multi-year effort. Here's some things that you could do in the next 6 months that would quickly reduce your risk related to cybercrime. And those are secure configuration, vulnerability management, strong authentication, security monitoring to detect indicators of compromise, and incident response capabilities. I want to think about this for a minute with you. Think about that list of 5 and think about how they fit into that NIST cybersecurity framework, where we saw at the highest level we had 5 security functions: identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. The mistake a lot of people make is they put all their security investment into protecting. That's under the assumption that you can fully protect, right? It's like you're making the false assumption that your protection will be completely successful and will never have to engage in incident response, will never fail, will never have to look into how this breach happened. The reality is you will fail. You will experience breaches, so you need to be ready to move beyond just protection, but into responding and recovering. And so the first three recommendations we're going to talk about are in that category of protection, but then security monitoring is in that category of detection or monitoring, and the last one is in responding and recovering. So talking about the first recommendation, secure configuration. Of those 23 resolution agreements that the Office of Civil Rights has delivered out to organizations for breaches and for failures in HIPAA compliance, 4 of them related to failures in this area, where they were specifically cited that these organizations failed to maintain a secure configuration and therefore experienced a breach, and that was a HIPAA violation and a failure to do good risk management, good security program development. And I list the 4 there. You can look at those. It's interesting to read and see what they did. Several of them, it was related to misconfiguration of a website or of a firewall that should have been protecting a website. It often came about when a change was made. So they were doing an upgrade or changing a configuration and didn't test it to make sure it was still secure after that was done. So critical security control number 3 talks about this: secure configuration for hardware, software on mobile devices, laptops, workstations, and servers. You could read what it says about it. This needs to be a rigorous process. It's something that you don't just put a secure configuration in at a point in time when you're first putting the server in place or first putting the workstation in place, but there needs to be a process to constantly test and maintain that secure configuration. Critical security control number 10 talks about the same thing, but with respect to network equipment, firewalls, routers, switches, VPNs. So just a few examples. Under each of these critical security controls, there are about 4 to 10 different more specific controls. So let's just read the first 3 from control number 3. These are all what are called quick wins, where they feel these are things you can do quickly to better protect yourself. So establish and ensure the use of standard secure configurations of your operating systems. Implement automated patching tools and processes for both applications and operating systems. And then limit administrative privileges to very few users. Give very few people the ability to change the configuration of a system. One way to do a good job, the question is, how do you know if you have a secure configuration? If you go to your system admins, your network engineers, and ask them, do we have secure configurations? They will probably say yes. They believe they're doing the right things. But how do you objectively answer that question? Is this a secure configuration? And there are some benchmarks or some checklists and templates out there that can help you to do that. So I list 4 of them here. These are the most common ones. Each of them have their strengths and weaknesses. The DoD STIGs are updated pretty frequently. The Center for Internet Security benchmarks are pretty widely used as well. So it's not a trivial effort, but I think a very worthwhile effort. If you have secure configurations, you're reducing your attack surface. You're making it less likely to, no, that's good. Okay. Go back to the previous slide. Yep, good. So it reduces your attack surface. That's how I often think about this. We use warfare language in security sometimes. So reducing the way that the cyber criminals can attack you, the way they can get a foothold in your organization and exploit your weaknesses. One One thing you can implement here would be to actually scan and test your configuration. You can set up a vulnerability scanner like Nessus to measure a server and test it against one of these benchmarks that we just talked about, and compare and see how secure you are, how hardened you are. Next topic is quite a bit related to secure configuration, vulnerability management. So here we're talking about a continuous process to learn about vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities surface every day. I think we've had 2 or 3 vulnerabilities, one in particular that comes to mind anyways, this week, called Logjam. So it's a problem, a weakness with a certain way of implementing SSL. These kind of things pop up all the time. So you need to be in tune, you need to be catching when those come up, you need to be receiving information feeds from organizations that are monitoring these vulnerabilities. US CERT is one good one. So the goal of vulnerability management is to identify, prioritize, reduce system vulnerabilities. Here it goes into a little bit of detail on this slide of how to do that. You need to you need to know what you have before you can manage your vulnerabilities. You need to know what systems you have so you can watch for those vulnerabilities related to those systems. Once you know what your assets are, one way you can know what they are is to use a Nessus scanner, scan your network, and it'll discover at the same time every asset and then every vulnerability on those assets. And it will give you that information in a prioritized way, in a risk-based way. And then you need to respond to these vulnerabilities, and there's 3 basic ways you can respond. You can remediate it, so that means you're going to eliminate that vulnerability, usually by applying a patch or by changing a configuration. Sometimes you find a vulnerability that you can't fully remediate because maybe you have some application dependency, and so you can't go to the latest version of Java because you have an application that can't work with that version of Java or something else. And so you have to figure out, how can I mitigate this vulnerability in some other way? So for example, with respect to Java, you could say, I'm not going to run that old version of Java on every workstation where it could be exploited by criminals and get malware installed. Instead, I'm going to install Java just on a Citrix desktop and require the users to go to that Citrix desktop and then run that Java application. Then you have just that Citrix server to worry about with respect to this vulnerability. So it's an example of mitigating it. Another one that I give here is maybe it's going to take you some time to solve a SQL injection risk on a website, so you throw a web application firewall in front of it. You can also accept a vulnerability. Just be careful that you really understand the implications of accepting it. Make sure that you've engaged a security person who can really help you think through what are the risks, how could this vulnerability be exploited before you decide to accept it. So the critical security control number 4 talks about vulnerability management. Yeah, thanks. So basically what happens when a vulnerability is discovered by somebody, a security researcher perhaps, they have some decisions to make what they're going to do with that knowledge that they have. And typically they will notify the vendor that's affected, say Microsoft or Adobe, like the Oracle, if it's an Adobe vulnerability, or Adobe, or Oracle if it's a Java vulnerability, and give that vendor some time to develop a patch before they tell the world. Some security researchers might not be that nice. In fact, some of them will even put the vulnerability up for sale, right? And that's how we get a lot of our zero-day vulnerabilities, that they sold that information to a criminal organization or to the NSA or to some other government organization. But once that vulnerability's been released in terms of information about it, there's a race that occurs, right, between the vendor who's trying to figure out how to patch the vulnerability, the criminal who's trying to figure out how to quickly exploit the vulnerability and take advantage of it and use it to steal information before people patch it. Thankfully, or from the criminal point of view, thankfully most of us are pretty slow to patch vulnerabilities anyways. That was kind of stated in the reverse, wasn't it? Unfortunately. And then you have the defenders, so that's us. We're trying to figure out how to quickly implement the solution once it's released. So my tips in this area, and I have a long list of tips here, to use a vulnerability scanner, to run it at least monthly. You should really run it as frequently as you have a patch cycle. Use the data. It doesn't do it any good to run a vulnerability scan and then ignore what it says, obviously. And then patch all of your operating system and all of your application vulnerabilities. You know, if you could do just what I said, just that, and do a secure configuration as well, do those two things, and most malware will fail to install on your systems. You'll just quit getting malware. That's what it takes. You know, I think we worry so much about why isn't my antivirus working? Well, forget about your antivirus. It's never going to keep up with all the malware that's out there. And no, don't really forget about it. You need it, but the solution is here to patch and to securely configure your devices, and then the malware will fail to install. Critical security controls recommend a 48-hour patch cycle. I think in healthcare that's not realistic with respect to the routine patch management. It's probably more like a monthly cycle where you have a monthly downtime window and apply your patches at that time. But there are those vulnerabilities that are so serious that you can't wait for that monthly patch cycle and you implement sooner and take some kind of emergency change control process. You can prioritize based on the vulnerability score, the CVSS score that comes out from US CERT and a couple of other MITRE and NIST. And then here I list a place you can subscribe to the US CERT vulnerability alerts. And then chart your progress, communicate, make this high profile. Don't bury this whole process in the IT department. Let people know, where do you stand? How are you doing? Let the executives know. You know, they don't need to know about every single vulnerability that comes out, but they should know where the organization stands with respect to these key critical security functions. Now, the third topic is quite different, strong authentication. We're all aware that, I think, or if you're not, I'll let you know, that most breaches involve compromised credentials. The Mandiant Threat Report really emphasizes this and says, I think they said 100% of the breaches they dealt with in 2014 involved compromised credentials. So by compromised credentials, I mean that someone stole IDs and passwords typically. So I list, that was the Anthem breach, right? A database administrator's credentials were stolen through a phishing attack. And so a criminal logged in as the database administrator, ran a query, downloaded the data, sent it off to themselves. The target breach also involved compromised vendor credentials. And then it's not just any credentials that the attackers want. Initially, they'll accept any credentials, but ultimately they want the elevated privileges. They want to get, the DBA's credentials. They want to get the system engineer's credentials. Those credentials that can let them go anywhere and do anything on the network. So that's part of their scheme as they get on your network. They go through a series of steps to attack you, and that's one of them. I think we're all aware that many people use weak passwords. As much as we've said this, passwords are hard to remember. They're just fraught with all kinds of horrible difficulties. How do we keep track of them? We're supposed to use a different one on every application, every website. How can I possibly do that unless I write them down or make it simple or make the variations trivial? So we have all these weaknesses. The most common password is password 1. But regardless But passwords just are inherently a problem, regardless of how long you make them, right? Because I don't care if you have a 20-character password. If you get a phishing attack and you get tricked like this DBA did into entering your passwords into the criminal's website that looks like your hospital's website, they can't tell the difference. But those credentials have been stolen by that criminal. It doesn't matter if it's a 20-character password or how complex it is, or how often it does help to change it frequently in that scenario, doesn't it? But the issue is that passwords are inherently weak. We also have the issue that people store them insecurely, that they hide them on a sticky note under their keyboard and or put them in a spreadsheet on the network. But the solution here is to get to multi-factor authentication, or often two-factor authentication. So the factors we're talking about are something you know, which can be a password or a PIN, something you are, which could be some kind of biometric, right? Your iris scan or the sound of your voice, various biometric characteristics, or something you have, like a smart card or your smartphone. And you combine that factor into the authentication process, and all of a sudden, the anthem breach doesn't happen. The target breach maybe doesn't happen, or at least it's much harder to occur. So I really think, and the threat reports that I read all concur, or many of them concur, that implementing two-factor authentication, even though it's costs some money and takes some work, it really dramatically brings down your risk of cybercrime. So my tips here are simple. I just ask the question, when should two-factor authentication be used? And the answer is when the risk level justifies it. So start with remote access. Most cyber criminals are going to attack you remotely, although some will attack you through a workstation. Protect those privileged accounts with two-factor authentication, vendor accounts, which are usually remote access anyway. And then ultimately, you probably want to move to protecting all sensitive data with two-factor authentication, but don't start there. It's affecting too many people. Now, so those were three that focused on protection. Now we're going to talk about how to detect criminal activity on your network. We don't have a lot of time to talk about this. It's a huge topic. But monitoring and detection is necessary for the reasons we've already talked about, that you can't ever be 100% sure that you've fully protected yourself. And unfortunately, many organizations aren't doing much in this area. It's an area where the capabilities are there, it can be done, the tools are there, but costs some money, takes some work. A lot of people, especially in healthcare, have not stepped up to this yet and really need to. It's very interesting to know that last year there were 3,000 organizations in the US notified by the FBI that they had been victims of a cyber intrusion. So think about that, 3,000 organizations. The FBI calls them on the phone, knocks on the door, says, I'm sorry to tell you, but your patient information or your customer information is all over the internet in this hacker forum, and you've been compromised. You need to figure out how it happened, and we're here to help you if you want us to help you, but you got to solve this. And it's important to know that if we can detect an intrusion in progress, detect it early in that progress, we have a chance to stop it before it fully, before they really walk away with your data. A data breach usually doesn't occur in a moment. It occurs over a period of time, of hours, days, even potentially weeks. And so you've got some time to detect that it's occurring and to put a stop to it. The Critical Security Control 14 talks about this. They call it maintenance, monitoring, and analysis of audit logs. This monitoring can go beyond audit logs. It can be alerts from security devices such as intrusion detection systems, but audit logs kind of catches the overall flavor of it. Sometimes those logging records are the only evidence of a successful attack. And as a matter of fact, pretty much every attack that occurs, there is an indicator of compromise out there. There's something in those logs that if you were just looking at it and understood what it meant, you would know that you were under attack. But the problem is no one's looking at it, or no one who understands it well enough is looking at it. It was true in the case of Target, right? I don't know if you know this, but the attackers installed 3 versions of malware, better and better malware, when they did that attack. And every time they installed the malware, their alerts went off, telling them telling Target that this had happened, but no one apparently responded and realized that this was serious and needed to take action. I think we're so used to malware occurring pretty frequently that we don't catch the significance of it sometimes and realize that it's not just a malware infection in isolation. It's one step in an attack that's going to lead to a breach. So some technology called SIM, Security Information and Event Management. It's the primary tool that's used to collect all these logs together and then to constantly analyze them. There are a lot of different SIM products out there, some that we and our customers have used and that others are using include Splunk, McAfee, Logarithm. There's a long list of them. It's actually a pretty mature area of security technology. So then the 5th topic, hope you're hanging in there with me, is to talk about incident response capabilities. So once you've learned from this security monitoring that something bad is happening or has happened, what do you do about it? It's not an obvious, the response isn't obvious unless you've been doing incident response for a while. So you really need some skilled people, some people who understand why these things would have occurred, what the motives would be of the attacker, as well as their techniques and tools and what they're trying to accomplish. Critical Security Control number 18 talks about that. In this most recent breach, I don't know if you've caught this one that's come to light, another healthcare payer, Care First, I believe it is, has just realized that they were attacked in a pretty similar manner to Anthem and Primera. And they got suspicious, they got nervous, the hair was bristling or something, and so they called in Mandiant and said, can you look over our systems and see, we're not sure whether we've been attacked or not. Well, they had been attacked, many months earlier. And see, the problem is that you get attacked and you don't catch the significance of it, and so the attack goes further. And you had some indicators, you could have perhaps stopped it, but you didn't realize what was really going on. So my tips are, you need to realize that security incidents are no longer this unusual, rare event that occurs. They're occurring all the time. And you should take that attitude. You should say, we are under constant attack. So I need somebody in my organization that is constantly watching for and responding to those attacks. So your incident response function needs to be continuous. And like I said before, it requires some people with the skills, with the time, with access to data, to that SIM data and other tools to continuously search for. You can just send these people out and say, okay, I know we're under attack somewhere, find them. Where are they? That's your job, that's your mission in life, find the attacker. A good resource on this, James Tarla from one of the SANS instructors has written a great paper called Be Ready for a Breach with Intelligent Response. So those are my 5 tips and recommendations on reducing your risk of cybercrime.